Jesus said, I'm the light, and he that followeth me shall not walk in darkness. And that is part of our scriptures that we look at this morning. We really open up there. Isaiah is going to prophesy about the darkness and the light and those contrasts. Jesus said, I'm the resurrection, I'm the life. He says, I'm the truth and the life. In the Revelation, we see a picture of Jesus where John sees a vision of him. He says, I'm the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, the Almighty. And then in the end of Revelation, he's described as the Lord of Lords, King of Kings. And we are called to him that are chosen and faithful. Peter says there's no salvation under the name of heaven by which we are saved. And Paul says to the Philippian church in Philippians 2, chapter 9, or verses 9 and 11, that he's been highly exalted, that everyone shall bow to the name of Jesus. All things under heaven and under earth. Christ is the Lord, and he's the glory of to the Father. And then, of course, Isaiah chapter 9, 6, our theme verse for us, until a child is born, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, the Mighty God, the Everlasting Father, and the Prince of Peace. And so that really talks about the commentary here. Again, I try to follow along with that. Looks at where we're at today. The Prince of Peace. So now we're going to read in Isaiah chapter 9. We're going to ask Gene to read Isaiah chapter 9, 1 through 7.
Nevertheless, the gloom will not be upon her who is distressed. And when it has first lightly esteemed the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, and after more heavily oppressed her, by the way of the sea beyond Jordan, in Galilee of the Gentiles. The people who walk in darkness have seen a great light. Those who dwell in the land of the shadow of death, on them a light has shined. You have multiplied the nation and increased its joy. They rejoice before you, according to the joy of harvest, as men rejoice when they divide the soil. You have broken the yoke of his burden, and the staff of his shoulder, and the rod of his oppress, and as the day in Midland. For every warrior sandals from the noisy battle. The garment rolled in blood will be used for burning and fuel of fire. For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government will be upon his shoulders, and his name will be called Wonderful, Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and peace there will be no end, upon the throne of David and over his kingdom, to order it and establish it with justice and justice from that time forward, even forever. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will perform this.
Thank you. All right, so we're going to break down Isaiah chapter 9, 1 through 7. There's a lot there. And we remember, although I don't put much background into this lesson, if you remember, Judah now sees the battle lines drawn. Judah, the southern part of the Israelite kingdom, sees destruction coming, possibly. Although we're going to see some of them doubt that. And we know what happens further on down the line. A remnant is taken into captivity. Some go into Egypt. Some go with the Assyrians And we know one, Daniel, is held captive of the king of the Assyrians, Nebuchadnezzar, and those other kings there. In the end of chapter 8, we see the contrast here. And again, Isaiah writes in contrasts all the time. And we see the earth, the trouble and darkness growing, the gloom, the dimness. And then in Isaiah chapter 9, we see opening up again this God of hope, this God of faith, this God of mercy. And even this time he has Isaiah write, "Nevertheless, the dimness shall not be such as in her vexation." When at first he lightly affected the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, and afterward did more grievously afflict her by the way of the sea, beyond Jordan, in the Galilee of the nations. So in chapter 9, we see that God, through the prophet Isaiah, is already moving from judgment to a promise of hope to his audience. Breaking down this idea of Zebulun and Naphtali a little bit, these are areas in the northern part of Israel. Later would be called Galilee. And in your commentary, we're going to see this idea opening up. It's a pathway by the way of the sea, a route between Damascus. And it's thought that the Assyrians used this road to travel down and attack Judah. Naphtali and Zebulun is contained a mix of population, Gentiles and Jews now. So one of the things we're going to see is Jewish brothers attacking Jewish brothers, really. The tribes of Israel have already infiltrated with the enemy, already joined arms with them in attacking Judah. No surprise there was division created by two kings. One of them went his own way and decided to worship God his own way. Isaiah chapter 2, verse 9, the people walked in darkness, having seen a great light, and they dwell in the land of the shadow of death. Upon where a light had shined. It remind me of verses in Psalms where the psalmist wrote, "He brought them out of darkness and the shadow of death, and he brake their bands asunder." Any comments or ideas so far? I don't want to.
I guess was interesting was verse 5 when it says, "Every warrior's sandals of the noisy battle and garments rolled in blood will be used for burning and for fuel of fire." You take your garments, I guess, and roll them, and didn't no blood burned.
Yeah, I think there's a description there of the a feat of war that's coming to embattle them, take them over. Before we get there, yes.
No, you're getting there. That's where I was going. It's fulfilled in Matthew chapter 4. Right after the temptation in the wilderness. This is the first prophecy Matthew uses to describe Jesus.
Yeah, this is the first prophecy that I think what you're saying here is that Jesus is taken to this area after leaving Nazareth. He goes into Galilee and he starts fulfilling this prophecy. Is that what you're saying? And notice again that he says here that in the land of Zebulun and Naphtali, by way of the sea, beyond the Jordan. So Matthew here is quoting from Isaiah chapter 1. So again, we looked at this last week. Some of these prophecies, the children of Israel, the children of Judah would not completely understand for hundreds of years on in the future. But God gives them hope and light that something would change. And again, this idea there would be a child born. And this was also in chapter 6, I believe, we saw another reference of Jesus. And the idea here of a government that would last. And it must be a message to those that had not given up on God, were faithful to God through all this. And Isaiah speaks to that. I believe it was in Isaiah 6 where he talked about the remnant. It's sometimes an application for us when it seems hopeless, when it seems that the whole world has turned their back on God. There are still people like us out there faithful to God. And he hasn't forgotten us.
Anger, his hand is still outstretched to them. I guess he never gives up on them.
Yeah. His hand, Gene's saying in verse 12, how God still extends a hand, the patience of God. And that's again a long theme we're looking at, is that he doesn't give up on us. He still extends hope. He still extends his grace where others would give up on us. And so in verse 7, again, this prophecy that they wouldn't understand at this time. And even in Jesus' time, some didn't get it. There would be a government that would not end. It would come through the throne of David. And there would be judgment and justice forever. Eventually we're going to see, this is a commentary from Thomas Constable, it's not in your book, the Jews were removed from their homelands by the Assyrians, which are the Gentiles, replaced with Assyrians and other non-Jews. And this sets the stage for this area becoming a melting pot of the Jews and the Gentiles. And this helps us better understand the name of the area, the Galilee of the Gentiles. And we see Jesus talking to this group when he comes, God in the flesh. Thus we see him talking to the woman at the well, which would be from this group of Jews that ended up mingling probably with the Assyrians. So that's the first 7 verses as we're flying through this commentary. Any comments there? Pretty straightforward. The thing that I keep being reminded of is, what were those people in the 8th century BC thinking when they heard these words spoke by the prophet Isaiah. It'd be hard for them to understand a lot of this commentary coming from Isaiah, because they wouldn't see it in their lifetime.
A lot of them we talked about last week were probably questioning why Isaiah is even telling them this.
Yeah.
Look at how prosperous we are. Look at how good things are. When Isaiah starts his ministry, things are going well in the nation of Judah, if you look at it from a worldly perspective.
Right. That's a good point, too. They would not only not understand what future things are going to occur, but why he's even telling them that. And we talked about this in Isaiah. The first 6 chapters really address their depravity, their walking away from God. And then there's a break where now we're going to start seeing what's coming. Now he starts warning them of the ultimate destruction. And they think, we're going to look at this in the lesson today, that what's wrong? We're doing everything right. We're even worshiping God right, the right way. Of course they weren't, but they felt they were. They had just changed a few things. Surely God doesn't mind. Okay, we're going to move to the next section. The Lord's anger undiminished. And we're going to ask Evelyn to read Isaiah chapter 9, 8 through 17.
The Lord has sent a message against Jacob. It will fall on Israel. All the people will know it, Ephraim and the inhabitants of Samaria, who say with pride and arrogance of heart, the bricks have fallen down, but we will rebuild with dressed stone. The fig trees have been felled, but we will replace them with cedars. But the Lord has strengthened Rezin's foes against them and has spurred their enemies on. Arameans from the east and Philistines from the west have devoured Israel with open mouth. Yet for all this his anger is not turned away. His hand is still upraised. But the people have not returned to him who struck them, nor have they sought the Lord Almighty. So the Lord will cut off from Israel both head and tail, both palm branch and reed in a single day. The elders and prominent men are the head. The prophets who teach lies are the tail. Those who guide his people misled them, and those who are guided are led astray. Therefore the Lord will take no pleasure in the young men, nor will he pity the fatherless and widows. For everyone is ungodly and wicked. Every mouth speaks vileness. Yet for all this his anger is not turned away. His hand is still upraised.
Okay, and you notice that's what Jean was just commenting on, the last verse there. For all this, his anger is not turned away. He's still angry, but his hand is still outstretched. And we're going to look at this a little bit of detail, but notice they're saying, that's all right. The world's coming down upon us. We'll rebuild. And so the lack of understanding there, what the Lord is about to do, they still don't understand. So the Lord brings out word against his people, and the word there is against Jacob, which would be his chosen people. And this is applied exactly against the kingdom of Israel. Ephraim and the inhabitant of the Samarian, the tribe of Ephraim, it says in the commentary, was the largest and most influential tribe in the northern kingdom. The Lord often refers to the kingdom of Israel by the name of Ephraim. He calls him Jacob, he calls him Ephraim. As we know from past studies, Samaria was the new capital of Israel, moved there by Jeroboam, one of the sons of Solomon. Remember, Jeroboam is the one that, I got that right? Jeroboam is the one that moved the worship practices away from God and carried 10 tribes with him. Rehoboam had 2 tribes in the southern kingdom of Judah. So these kingdoms moved away from God. And God is telling them again, I'm going to restore this kingdom with a king that's everlasting. I'm still extending the hope to you. But I'm still going to judge you. So like Michael was commenting on a minute ago, in their pride, the leaders and the people, and notice those 2 things are going to come up again. So remember that. The leaders and the people said, who cares if God judges us? Whatever's torn down, we'll rebuild. We'll do it. We'll make it something better. We've nothing to fear from God. Whatever he can bring against us. Imagine the arrogance of that. And so it reminds me of how when we pray, we need to be remembering who we're praying to. A God that's just, a God that's righteous, a God that has anger. And it's one that we should have that respectful fear towards. Instead of humbling themselves, as God's warning them to do, before the face of God, and many physical calamities, and many of them already descended upon them, they can see this happening. They still entertain a lighthearted optimism. This is by a commentator named Bulletin. And these ideas were on their lips. We'll build it back again. We're not afraid of God, I might add. For the first time, judgment against Israel was not enough. It couldn't overcome their pride. But God wasn't finished. He was going to judge their sin. Isaiah 9:16, for the leaders of these people cause them to err, and they that are led of them are destroyed. Again, that theme, the leaders and the people that follow along. When we consider our worship to God, is that an application we need to be warned of? Is that something for us to consider? People get up and lead us through the Bible, and what are we supposed to do? Study the scriptures, right? Make sure that we're approved, we're workmen, we're all fallible. But we don't see that happening today, do we? People blindly following along their leaders. I got jokes. Therefore, the Lord will cut off Israel's. Here again, this is this metaphor now. Who is the head and who is the tail? Test question coming up later. The head is the leaders, the tail are the followers. The branch and the rush in one day. The ancient and honorable and those that tell lies are the tail. Any comments so far? For the wickedness burneth as a fire, and it shall devour the briars and the thorns, shall kindle the thickets in the forest, and mount up like the lifting of a smoke. And so one commentator said, moral corruption burns like a fire among the people. And ultimately, the people bring destruction upon themselves. And that is another theme in this. Isaiah is telling them, God's not doing this, you're doing this to yourself. And then at the end, we're going to see this theme again, as we saw last week. The people are greedy. They're even stealing from their neighbors. Never get enough. And the prophet is alluding to this idea that Israel and Judah are even turning against one another. And many of the Jews have already linked up with the Assyrians to destroy Judah. Something they would have never imagined. And he shall snatch on the light hand and be hungry, and he shall eat on the left hand and shall not be satisfied. They shall eat every man the flesh of his own arm. And so again, Isaiah is saying that they're going to steal from one another, take from the needy, not be concerned about those that are less able to defend themselves. And then he addresses in Isaiah chapter 9:21, Manasseh, Ephraim, Manasseh, which are two tribes of Israel, and they together shall be against Judah, which is another line of Israel. For all this anger is not turned away, but the hand is stretched out still. Again, that's the allusion to God. So brother would be turning against brother to destroy one another. No mercy, no grace. And again, this calls back, and this is in your commentary, to Genesis chapter 40:20. And he blessed them that day, saying that thee shall Israel bless, saying, God make thee as Ephraim and as Manasseh. And he set Ephraim before Manasseh. So this is also prophecy where the order of line was out of order, caused division and jealousy. We're going to ask Gene to read the last section in the commentary, which is more woes. And that'd be Isaiah chapter 10, 1 and 2.
Woe to who decree unrighteousness decrees, who writes misfortune, which they have prescribed, to rob the needy of justice and take what is right from the poor of my people. The widows may be their prayer, and that they may not rob the fatherless.
Thank you. This is another reminder, if you remember, we were studying last week Isaiah chapter 6. The widows and the orphans were brought up again there by God. What New Testament book speaks specifically about the widows and orphans? Does anybody remember? What New Testament book addresses the fatherless, the widows, the orphans? James, I heard, yep. James chapter 1. Pure religion is this: to visit the widows and the orphans, the fatherless. And so that's another reason why the church, as we consider the benevolence, we consider these groups, It's a strong theme throughout the Bible that we're, as Christians, to take care of those that are less fortunate, at least physically less blessed. And woe would be to those that don't. And it should be a strong warning to us today. And especially when we take advantage of those that are less fortunate to gain from them. And that's in page 66 of your commentary. God has a dim view of that, I would say. So to me, this chapter, this lesson is pretty straightforward. We see the lack of humility, the lack of self reflection on what they were doing to one another, what was about to descend upon them, and their lack of consideration for God who is just, who will judge. And so part of our applications is that our hope is always in the Lord. He is the light. And that's, of course, one of the names that Jesus gives himself, isn't it? I am the light, I am the way. And yet the people walked in darkness, and they've seen a great light and dwell in the land, although they're under the shadow of death. There was still a light that shined. And the Lord is patient, long-suffering, and he always has a plan of redemption for us. Israel was punished for their pride, Isaiah chapter 9:9. Their refusal to repent, Isaiah chapter 9:13. They were judged for their unrestrained wickedness, Isaiah 9:18. And in Isaiah chapter 10:1-2, for their refusal to care for the most vulnerable amongst them. What did Jesus call the Pharisees and Sadducees? Raka, remember? They were giving their money they claimed to the temple instead of taking care of their parents. Same theme, same message. Any comments or questions?
Well, I tried to emphasize too, no matter what their punishment on each other is that he has the final say. You know, he's got the final say on their judgment.
Great point. Gene brings up the fact that the people said, well, if you judge us, we'll just build it back again. And God is saying, no, I'm the final judge. You won't build it back. They didn't, because they were, of course, all taken away into captivity, weren't they? And replaced by the Syrians.
You were saying something about helping the widows and orphans. There's a lot of verses. It's in Psalms, in Exodus. Mary mentioned James, Timothy. So throughout the whole Bible, that's what we're supposed to do.
Throughout the whole Bible, the idea of taking care of those that can't take care of themselves. And in the Old Testament time, especially the widows, those that didn't have and it's still today, although the government wants to replace God, I think, in a lot of these things. It's the church's mission. It's us as the church to fend for these people. And sometimes we don't see results. We try to participate in handing out food, work at the homeless shelter on Tuesday evenings. And we are currently given to an orphan foundation, Wichita, I believe. And we're doing some things like that. We're not doing enough, but we try. But this is a theme throughout the whole Bible. Good comment. Any others? Okay, we got questions then. We're moving fast today. What two tribes in the northern part of Israel were mentioned as being opposed to one another? Yeah. When he first lightly afflicted the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, I can't say that. I might have that spelling or pronunciation wrong. Contained a mixed population of the northern Israel tribes. The region occupied by a tribe of Zebulun. The region which was occupied by the tribe was directly north of Zebulun, Ephraim. And then you had the Sea of Galilee, which would be important as Jesus came through as the Prince of Peace to help remedy what man had done. So when we read the stories, and we're trying to focus in this year on the stories of Jesus, we can start seeing this link and this prophecy fulfilled where Jesus, his ministry occurs around the Sea of Galilee, and how important and significant that is to God through the prophet Isaiah. What did Isaiah say the people in darkness would see?
Great light.
I've seen a great light, and who would that great light be? Jesus. God. Exactly. What would the coming Messiah do for the downtrodden nation of Israel? Isaiah chapter 9, 3 and 4. Multiply the nation, increase the joy, according to the joy and harvest. So it was likened to this joy they would gain from the harvest. If you're a good farmer or a good gardener, I'm not in that category. For thou hast broken the yoke of his burden and the staff of his shoulder, the rod of his oppressor in the day of Midian. Can you see how those metaphors come through in the New Testament? Who talks about a yoke in the New Testament? Take this yoke upon me. Jesus says, cast this yoke on me, for my burden is light. The staff is on his shoulder as a reference to the authority. Jesus is described as a rod that would not bend like a reed in the pond with the wind. And so our trust and faith is in a God who doesn't waver, who doesn't bend. What king is the coming Messiah associated with in Isaiah chapter 9, 7? I'm sorry? King David. Of the increase of his government and the peace there shall be no end upon the throne of David. What line did Jesus come through? The line of David. Judgment and justice. Don't we want a just God? And aren't we seeing some of the differences today in our world? It seems like there's two justices right now, depending on where you're at. I won't go any further. What did the Israelites believe they had the ability to do in Isaiah chapter 9, verse 10?
And to be filled with God
We can build back those hewn stones. And my version says we'll just plant cedars where those sycamores were. Of course, that's not us today, is it? We're not that prideful to think we can do it better than God. What two groups did the Lord say he would cut off? The head and the tail,
Elders and the honorable men.
the ancient, the honorable. Yeah, there was several metaphors there. And we always want to say we got to be careful who's leading us. And we talked about this last week. Jesus used many parables to teach lessons. And it reminds me of the one we referenced last week. One of the parables he talked about was the blind leading the blind into a ditch. So these leaders were blind to the justice of God, and many of them would be led right into a ditch. To what does Isaiah compare Israel's wickedness to? Isaiah chapter 9, verse 18.
Fire. Runs like a fire. Consumes briars and thorns.
As a fire that will devour the briars and the thorns. That's exactly right. Oops, get that out of there. Whom did the leaders of Israel take advantage of? Isaiah chapter 10. The poor, the widows, the defenseless, they're the ones that suffer the most. Easy prey, we might say. Okay, I just about dazzled you all. I can see it in your faces. I appreciate it. Appreciate all your comments. Next week, the Lord willing, the snow don't come and the creek don't rise. Lesson number 8, Isaiah chapter 11, verse 1, 12, 6. A shoot from the stem of Jesse. Thank you.